On the nonprofit side, AI has the opportunity to sort of fill those gaps where they wanted to hire, but they can't. AI can really help that with these mission-driven organizations.
This is Get It Together, the podcast where partnership and go-to-market leaders share the real stories behind programs they've built and scaled. Most partner programs don't fail because the partners are bad, because of course they're not bad. They fail because the program is built around a wrong assumption or a few different wrong assumptions. One of those assumptions I commonly see is that partners are mainly motivated by money, right? They want a kickback. They want their commission, a referral fee. In this episode, I talk with Josh Meyer to unpack what he learned scaling a partner program from loose spreadsheets and about 100 partners into a very structured ecosystem of over 600 partners. My biggest takeaway in this conversation, the best partners, they want access to you, your enablement. They want to be viewed as credible. They want a solid co-sell motion. They want joint thought leadership that they can go to market with. And they want a really strong relationship with your sales team, more so than they do a referral check, right? They really want to understand, how do I build a business around being a partner with your piece of technology? We get into how Josh used webinars as almost partner currency, why he decided to connect partners directly with AEs and kind of skip any sort of middle person in that, and how that was really a big unlock to helping his program scale, how to avoid making the partner manager a bottleneck, and why that kind of operational move really, really paid off. This was a very practical conversation with somebody who's been there. They've done it at a high level, and they've done it in a space that can be challenging, which is nonprofit enterprise technology. Enjoy the episode. Welcome, everybody, back to another episode of Get It Together. Today, I am with Josh Meyer. Josh, how are you doing? I'll introduce you in a second, but how's the day so far?
It's doing all right. It is a truly San Francisco day. It is a little foggy outside, expecting a summer sun in the afternoon, so it'll be fantastic.
It sounds like you got it all today then.
Yeah.
Not bad. Over 20 years across nonprofits and enterprise software. You've led marketing, you've led growth teams. Of course, you've led partnerships and channel. You are currently leading the marketing org at Muse Software, which I think is a pretty cool vertical solution for museums and cultural institutions. What did I miss?
No, I mean, that was great.
Is that good?
Yeah, it's real good. I think what's interesting on my story is I started in nonprofit and then flipped over to tech.
Let's start there. I love hearing about people's journeys. So you started in nonprofit, correct me if I'm wrong, events, fundraising. From there, you moved into marketing leadership. What did that journey look like? I'd love to hear a little bit of that.
Yeah, so I went to undergrad in Washington, D.C. I was ready to change the world, right? And so I did so. When I came out of university, I started the Human Rights Campaign as a fundraiser. So being on the front lines, doing event fundraising for most of that time. And I really loved the sort of relationship building and the storytelling that came with that. And so, used that, but then also I was a tinkerer, right? I always wanted to sort of, how can we be more efficient and how can we use tools and technology to improve our fundraising outcomes? Took that, those first 8 years, that first sort of bit of my career, and then used that to sort of jump into nonprofit tech, initially at a company called One Cause. So helping online fundraising and event fundraising. And that's where I really started formalizing my marketing career. That is where I sort of started my first B2B marketing role and pulled some of those things that I learned from fundraising into marketing. Again, sort of that relationship building. How can you use relationships, to further, B2B marketing, right? And sort of the storytelling aspect. How, when I was at the Human Rights Campaign, it was like, how can we get people to support our mission, to, give, right? And really pull that through. And so that was really great over at One Cause. And then most recently, before Muse, I was at a company called Bloomerang, which is nonprofit CRM. And that is where I had the opportunity to really dive in about channel and channel marketing and really pull in even further more of that relationship building. I think that we're going to talk a little bit more about.
Yeah, I want to dive into Bloomerang in a second. You mentioned tinkering. I love that term. I've always felt the same about myself is like, if I were to point to anything that has helped me in my career, it's, I think, been a tinkerer. Any fun tinkering stories? Like what are some of the things that you tried in those early days, nonprofit, things you tinkered with that, led to really interesting outcomes or learnings, things that you've carried with you? I'm always curious on what people are tinkering with.
I mean, what's interesting right now is like, I feel like I'm doing so much tinkering with AI. In the early days, what we were looking at, and this is like the mid aughts, right? And one of the big challenges we had was I would do the Human Rights Campaign at that time was doing about 25 annual like black tie galas. And it was all based out of the office in DC. And I'd go out and I'd sort of help support them. And we have, these amazing volunteer committees who would sort of help execute the events. But the silent auction was such a pain. And so I think you had this sort of concept where you'd have people be bidding on all these auction items, like leading into dinner. And you always want to try to keep it open as long as possible to try and get the most outcome out of that. But then at the end, if you kept it open too long, you couldn't reconcile who won and notify them that they won so that they could pick up the item when they left. And there was just numerous headache stories there around silent auction closeout. Where I started to tinker is how can we make that process more efficiently, right? In the early days, it was those knuckle busters, right? Where you would take your credit card and you'd put it down and use the triplicate. For those of our viewers who are listeners who remember that, right? And you'd sort of take the imprint and then you would go process the credit card, the next day in the office. And it just wasn't efficient. And so we started tinkering with like, how could we use technology and how could we started using, credit card readers that used a signal, a cell signal, and that helped improve it. And then we started exploring technology that would sort of capture that credit card up front. This is before credit card tokenization was a big thing. And sort of being able to store it securely and making sure. And so really sort of tiptoeing into some of those technologies and trying to figure out how could we bring that into the organization to just really improve efficiency, because we felt like if we could improve efficiency in that silent auction, we could raise more money and then further support the mission. So just a lot of sort of testing along those lines and trying to improve those processes.
Very cool. I like that. Going back to Bloomerang. So you join, and based on one of our previous conversations, you were given about 100 partners and just told, hey, take care of them. Which is not uncommon. For whatever reason within partnerships, it seems like, hey, you know what? We got a bunch of partners. Can you just take this on and run with it? What was the state of the partner program at that point? Where did you take it? Let's walk through that journey a little bit, because I think that's always a fun one.
You are correct, right? It was sort of like, here's a spreadsheet, here's 100 partners. There was some notes on some of them, and that was about it. I knew that there was gold in there, and I knew that there was some success out of that program, but there weren't I wasn't given here's the metrics for the last quarter, and here's who's really invested, and here's who's not. And so I think it was nonprofit, right? Everyone says industry is like a special snowflake, right? So I'm going to say that with nonprofits, but I'm going to back it up with a little bit of data here. Nonprofits are typically laggards when it comes to technology adoption. And, sometimes when you're sort of implementing new technology, there's risk associated, and nonprofits in general are risk adverse. That's not like a hard and fast rule, but it's something that I've observed in, the 20 plus years that I've been in the industry. And so, but what is, really well known is this word of mouth, right? Like there's these informal networks of nonprofits, whether that's sort of by vertical, like all the food banks get together, every year, and sort of all the museums and so on and so forth. And so they all talk to each other. And so I knew that many of these partners were fundraising consultants, right? And so I knew that if they like Bloomerang, like the product that we offered, it was easy for them, it was easy for their customers, like there was going to be win-win if they adopted the software, and that they would continue to do that word of mouth advertising for us, then investing in these partners was a no-brainer. But it was how do we get about that? How do we sort of formalize a program, and what are the steps that we needed to take? And so that was sort of really the aha moment was okay, we have these partners who like us. I don't know where on the spectrum of like us do they fall. How do we deepen those relationships, and how do we create something that's a little bit more scalable, and then really start scaling the program? that was sort of the beginning of it. And I'm happy to I know you have some sort of follow-up questions on this. So, let me know where you want me to go on that storytelling.
Let's just keep going down the path of the story. So what next?
What we learned, for the first thing we did is, myself and our CMO at the time, we took that list of 100 and we divided and conquered, and we wanted to introduce ourselves. The CMO was, I think, 6 months into the role. I was her sort of first VP hire to come on board. And so we wanted to sort of continue building those relationships. The previous head of marketing, there was a little bit of overlap, and then he ended up departing. And so we just called through the entire list. I think we emailed everyone, and we set up, we wanted to take, 20, 30, 15 to 30 minutes to, really get to know those partners or just introduce ourselves. So that they at least had a point of contact. And that those initial conversations, they weren't exploratory. They were just sort of, hey, I'm Josh. I know that you were working with that previous partner or previous head of marketing. And, we'd love to be able to continue that partnership. And that was, we got some good nuggets out of that. We could kind of tell who was involved and, who was more vested in and not. But it was just a really good laying the ground. I quickly realized then that we needed to hire someone to help manage this, because there was a lot more here that I could handle individually. So we brought in a colleague. Her name was Kate, and she was our channel partner manager. We were calling it the program partner manager. And one of the things that we then wanted to sort of understand is like, what drives these partners, right? Some of these partners were really small. They were, consultancies of one, right? They had maybe been former fundraisers themselves, wanted to get out of the day-to-day grind, and, had a lot of knowledge. And so, became, consultants. Some of them are larger, were larger or consulting organizations, and some were sort of other tech partners that we had relationships with. And so the next thing we did is really wanted to sort of dive on sort of what drives those partners. Why are they part of the program? What are the outcomes that they're looking at? What are the mutual wins there? And so we interviewed, I think between Kate and I think we interviewed like 20 to 30 of the partners. And it was a random selection. Some that we knew that were really engaged, some that had signed up, many years ago. And we wanted to try and pull in, understanding. And then we did, I think, at least one, if not two surveys, right? Just trying to understand sort of where they are and sort of how can we best work with them. And one of the key findings here out of that surveys was that was just blew my mind, right? I thought, people were in partners for they wanted to be a part of the partner program for the financial benefits, right? We had sort of like a referral spiff program. It was really loose. I kind of didn't even know that it was there until someone sent me an email with their partnership and the deal that had just closed and say, hey, pay me on this. And I'm like, wait, what? It didn't surprise me, but it did catch me off guard because I didn't even know that there were formal agreements out there. But when we did that survey, what became really clear is that about 50% of our partners that we had in the program, and this is like that initial 75 to 100 that we had, didn't want to get paid. The driving factor for them wasn't financial. It was rather that they wanted to make sure that the clients that they were referring were getting the best software. And they felt like, and in that case, that was us. And then I think, when we dove a little bit deeper in those conversations, it was apparent that when they had the best software, it made the consultants' life better and they had better outcomes for their consultant, which I had to, I don't know that I asked this directly, but then I think it got them paid more, right? Because they got more business out of that engagement because everything was just easier to do and they could really help the mutual clients really succeed in their fundraising and really help them drive their mission. That was like a huge aha moment. It was sort of like, okay, so now we kind of know what these driving factors are. Then how do we start thinking about scale? And that was sort of the last piece in that was, all right, we had to design a program that wasn't specifically based on a monetary compensation or some sort of, financial agreement. We had to create a program that had sort of multiple leverage point, or not leverage points, but winning, multiple opportunities that could provide incentives for those partners.
Yeah, that's awesome. At PartnerStack, even being a partner tech company that's working with partnership leaders all day, every day. Even in our own program in the early days, we had to keep reminding ourselves that so many partners aren't in this just for cash, right? They're not doing this because they want to get a kickback on a referral. They're doing this because they want to be viewed as a legitimate partner to their customers. They want to introduce the best tech. They want to build their services around the best tech. That's what they're interested in. Maybe it sounds obvious when you say it out loud, but I think especially when you're just day to day in business and things can feel somewhat transactional, you lose sight of the fact that, hey, it's not all transactional. It is relationships. There are other outcomes that people are trying to drive beyond just a referral spiff or whatever it might be. And then, one of the things that led us to, and I'd be curious if you've done anything similar, a lot of our partner enablement was just product enablement. It was, hey, we got these new features coming out. Here's how you can talk about it. Here's, the value it brings. And that was fine. But really, our program didn't start to take off until we introduced enablement around how to build a service arm around PartnerStack. Like, here are how other agencies, a lot of our partners are agencies, here are how the best agencies are building a practice around implementation of PRMs, around managing affiliate programs. Here is, a playbook for going to market and selling this. Here is how you can think about, a retainer versus project based. Like, we started to do enablement around like the business side of it. And that really unlocked quite a bit for us. Anything similar that you have seen or you did, or was it a little bit looser? And I'd be curious on where you went with that finding that, hey, it isn't just transactional.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think it really became apparent that this is about relationship building, right? This is, if it's not the financial, right, then it's sort of like, how do we incentivize, or how do we sort of help, drive business, right? And it became, like, how do we strengthen those relationships? So Kate and I, between the two of us, I think, as the number of partners grew, right? I think it was just shy of 600 when I left about a year ago. It just wasn't scalable. I think once we got to like 150, 200, it was like we couldn't do one-to-one relationship building with each individual partner. And so we had to sort of punt and try and figure out, okay, we didn't think like we needed a junior person on the team, but I was like, how could we leverage the organization as a whole, right? The company as a whole, to sort of help us achieve these like mutually beneficial goals, right? Depending on what department you stood in. And so we reached out to our colleagues over in sales, and what we ended up doing is starting to pair partners with an AE. And so each AE had a handful of partners that they were responsible for. And it sort of to that enablement piece, right, that gave the partner like a direct, phone line, email line, however you want to look at that, to someone who could help them answer many of their questions. Oftentimes, right, like the partner was referring business. And so it made sense to just, cut the BDR out and put it right in front of the AE, because most of these partners have already pre-qualified the deal anyway, right? So let's get it right to an AE. And then that relationship with the AE just continued to blossom over time, right? The AE loved it because it helped them hit their quotas, right? The partner loved it because they had someone that they could reach out to with any questions that they had, and it helped. And then it would go back and forth. Like, as we would develop, product or new features or new functionality, right, we would do a quarterly webinar for all of the partners and get them up to date. But then the AE would do monthly sort of check-ins. We would give them a snippet, right, an email snippet that they could include in an email to their partners. So we were trying to make it as easy as possible for the AEs, but then they could sort of customize that. And we saw what that ended up creating is this like really lovely relationships that then just continue to blossom. Something that I couldn't have done by myself, or even between Kate and I, right? We just didn't have the way to scale, but it was a really great way to find a win-win for everyone involved.
I want to stay on this because what you just said is something we see so few partner programs do, but the ones that do it tend to be quite successful with it. And the in all of this is just connecting partners directly with your AE. Most programs, they have the middle person, whether that's a BDR to do qualification, whether that's a channel partner manager whose plain middle person is like really working the relationship with the partner, which is fair. It's part of the job. But then they're also doing deal qualification. They're being protective of an AE's time before anything gets over to them. They're kind of stewarding the deal as both sides are working it. That can work, but it is a bit of a bottleneck. And you're you're removing the partner from being as close to the deal as possible to a certain degree. I love this motion where you're just connecting the partner directly with the AE. They're building relationships with those partners. I've seen that lead to way more effective co-selling motions. And correct me if I'm wrong, but what I'm hearing you say is this was somewhat pivotal to you scaling from those, call it 100 partners to 600 partners by the time you had left. Is that a fair statement?
It is. Yeah, it was. I mean, it just allowed us to grow faster. Right. And I think that's the key, to the point where as I was leaving, we were sort of reassessing. I forget the numbers, but we had some AEs that had, 10 to 15 partners, and that was feeling a little overwhelming. But some of those partners were producing more than others. And so we started having conversations on, like, you only get assigned an AE if there was some sort of threshold, right? You have to have referred a deal or two in the past 12 months, right? Otherwise, you were sort of the program or the partner manager was sort of your main point of contact, and it was more generic. The communication was a little bit more generic. It wasn't quite as personalized. And I think incentivizing, the partners, right? Like if you want that one-to-one relationship, almost using that as leverage to incentivize them to sort of provide more of our business and vice versa.
Yeah, and I think the resourcing piece of it, I think, is so critical here. Every partner team that we talk to, regardless of size of company, they all struggle with having enough resources. I've never met a partner team that says, you know what, we feel pretty good. We've got enough folks to support this program. And by just bringing resources you already have in the AE and making that connection, having them drive an element of this, I think solves some of that, which is just an overlooked approach that I think a lot of companies should be considering.
Yeah, like figure out how we can use the resources. And then sometimes I get it. Like, I mean, sales and marketing never have skirmishes. Wink, wink, right? But I think if you have a really good relationship with your sales leaders, and I think that's worth trying, because it absolutely worked for us. And some of those AEs we had to push, right? But once they realized like how this could unlock and really help them, they were all in. It worked out really well.
As you were scaling 100 to 600 partners, you had the realization that it's not just transactional, it's just not monetary incentives that they're interested in. You had built this like fairly robust program to help bring thought leadership to the table, enable them beyond just product. And so I was curious kind of how that came to be, what it looked like, what you learned, what worked, what didn't work.
So we had this webinar program. This was a thought leadership webinar program. And the way that it worked is every Thursday afternoon, there would be a consultant, a partner, right, would come on and present some sort of thought leadership content to our audience. We had a email list of about, I think it was 150, 200,000 people. And so we would sort of push out every week, here's the next 3 webinars for the next 3 weeks, and here's the content. And we got a really good showing. Some topics had more than others, but it was a very good show up rate on those webinars. And it was incredibly turnkey, right? Because all I had to do was come on the webinar, sort of introduce myself, introduce the company, introduce the presenter for the day, and hand it over to them, and they did their content. And then at the end, we would put up a poll that would say, hey, would you like additional information from Bloomerang? Would you like additional information from the partner? And then we would send them all the leads for people who wanted additional information from them. And the partners loved that because it was a great source of lead generation for them. In the early days, we were just kind of, a partner asked to be on the webinar, we just put them in, right? And then we quickly realized that as this program started to scale, like we only had 52 weeks in the year, and pull out, some of the major holidays, we're probably looking at somewhere between 45 and 48 webinars. And we have a partner program that starts getting to 200, 300 partners, like you just don't have enough slots. And so we created some other opportunities for presenting with us. We created this concept of this fundraising focus week, where in 1 week we would do, instead of an hour webinar on Thursday, we would do 4 webinars that were 30 minutes, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and then on Thursday, we would sort of regroup on everything. So create more opportunities there. We also started inviting partners to present with us at conferences. And so, they would come in and oftentimes they would bring mutual customers. And so like made that a little bit easier. But at the end of the day, we still just didn't have enough slots. And so what we ultimately ended up doing is we started tiering. And so like so we started looking at the partners that were engaged with us. Sometimes it didn't necessarily mean that they were bringing us business. Sometimes it was they were helping us with retention, and sometimes they were, providing other sort of resources that were beneficial to us. But the big thing obviously was, how much business are referring to us? And because we wanted those webinars, those speaking engagements to be mutually beneficial, right? If we put a partner on there who just gets on every 18 months and we don't hear from them, until they raise their hand again to ask when they can next be on the webinar, like that feels very one-sided. We really took those opportunities of speaking engagements that the partners really enjoyed, and that were beneficial to them, and sort of then use that as part of the, I am air quoting for those of you that are sort of just listening and not at the video, compensation, right? It was the way that we could give them that spiff, that we could give them that incentive. And that worked really, really well because we were limited, right? It gave us a way to sort of prioritize, who got slots and who did.
I love that. As you're scaling, at some point, correct me if I'm wrong, you did make a decision to adopt tech to help with the program management. How did you make that decision to say, you know what, the manual work is at a point where it's worth investing into tech? I'm always curious about that decision-making process. And I'm curious because candidly, like, I don't think everybody does need tech. Like, you sell partner tech, and I tell people regularly, like, you don't need PartnerStack right now. How did you make that decision that it was the right time to invest?
A version of that conversation internally multiple times until we actually pulled the trigger. And, I think CRMs can get you, I don't know, it depends, right? But like, somewhere between 60 to 70% of the way if you have a smaller program, right? And we were fine. We could sort of manage it. We could sort of create lists and figure out who referred what, and then, do the payment. It got to a point though, where it was like investing in the tech would actually be less expensive than bringing on another person, right, to do it. And we could get more out of the tech than we'd have if we had another body doing that. And so a lot of this came down to, it wasn't just us, like it was also, we had to get our finance, as we're trying to figure out like who gets checks and when do we cut it. And, I think we were doing it once a quarter and the partners wanted it sooner. And so like some of that all started bubbling up. I think the other piece was the communication, right? It was sort of like, I can't remember if we had like a Google Drive for them where all the like slicks that they could have access to, right? Like that becomes also a little bit unmanageable when you start 400, 500, 600. And then we had no great tracking on like who's using what resources are popular, which aren't. And so that was sort of a bunch of the considerations that we made as it was sort of like, okay. And then I think the final piece, back to the finances, it was like, we wanted to create a more sophisticated program, like where there were accelerators, right? So if you referred more business, for those of the partners that were financially motivated, right, you could earn more with us, right? If you referred more business. And so that just becomes a lot, a whole ball of wax that like we didn't feel like that we could handle easily. And so that was where tech came in. And as I was leaving, we were just implementing PartnerStack. I think we looked at a number of the solutions, and that just felt like that was the best one for us at the moment, given the existing tech stack that we had.
Honestly, I didn't even know that you had picked PartnerStack. Now you're at Muse.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about Muse, because I think it's super cool. And what have you brought with you in terms of the learning? Before you dive in, I also think as the head of marketing, how do you view partnerships? Because it's rare to have somebody with both a little bit of a marketing background and a partnership background. So I think there's always a really cool, unique perspective there. So that's a jumbled mess of questions.
Try and be efficient on the answer here, but Muse is great. So like, I think Muse is a continuation of the journey, right? So it is my personal journey, right? It is nonprofit mostly that we target. And so I have a really good understanding of that, but there's nuances with museums, right? Museums need a CRM. They need fundraising database, right? They need to be able to do online donations. They also need membership, right? Which I think is not all CRMs do that well. And then there's this unique ticketing aspect to museums, right? And sort of, yeah, you can just do tickets, right? Like you could use, sort of a really basic ticketing solution, but often these museums have, general admission, and then you need special timed entry for the special exhibit or the IMAX or, whatever that may be. And so when I introduced to Muse, I'm like, oh, this makes so much sense because it is ideal for, these museums who are looking for an all-in-one solution. So they don't have to sort of deal with multiple point solutions. And then all of their data is in one place. That makes it a lot easier for the museums to understand, the person who spent $500, $1,000 on the gift shop, right, and has been to the museum, 4 or 5 times in the past 6 months, right? Oftentimes those historically lived in 2 different systems. And with Muse, you can see that whole picture. And so then the development office, the head fundraiser can then go in and say, oh, they spent $500 and they've been to the museum 6 times, this is a major gift, prospect, or like we should solicit them for a higher level of membership. And it's really hard to do that if you don't have that data. And so, where we started today was tinkering, right? And I think this makes the tinkering a lot easier, right? It makes it that you don't have to be looking at 3 different solutions, 3 different software to try and get to that picture. And when I saw what the team at Muse was building, I was like, immediately like, this is going to change how museums operate and make it a lot easier for them and really help them drive their mission. Post pandemic, many museums have been struggling and trying to figure out what is, how do they incentivize and how do they bring people in the door? And, a tool like Muse helps with that. When you think about, marketing and partners, I am super excited because I do believe that very similar to previous roles, right? There are, consultants and partners who specialize in this space. And I think being able to engage them and build a partner program is something that I'm very excited about. Muse is a seed stage organization at this moment. So a lot of what I've been doing in the past 6 months I've been here is just sort of laying that groundwork, the infrastructure, the marketing infrastructure, so that we can then quickly scale up. So that there isn't a list of an Excel spreadsheet of the current partners, but that lives in a more structured system to make it easier across the board. And then obviously, a couple of years down the road, right, we'll have that same internal conversation. When does it need? When are we at the point where we need to bring in technology? But I think there's just very much like nonprofits in general, museums, really, the word of mouth is huge. I know there's a need for the partner program. It's just sort of when is the right time to really start kicking that off.
Very cool. Nice. I have 2 final questions for you.
All right.
Number 1, any predictions on what this world looks like, leading marketing, partnerships in this new world? What does this look like over the next, call it 24 months?
I think on the nonprofit side, right? So nonprofits they're always told to do less with more. And I think on the nonprofit side, AI has the opportunity to sort of fill those gaps where they wanted to hire, but they can't. But then, I think AI can really help that with these mission-driven organizations. I read a stat today. It was actually a company produced sort of the state of AI and nonprofits, and it's only about 10% of the organizations have fully adopted it. Like, I think it was like 50 to 60% are sort of like, it's like they're dabbling in it, but many don't even have paid accounts. So it's like there's interest there. And I think once the nonprofit sector can sort of really embrace it, it's going to help some of those pains that they've had, right? Where they're told to do less or more, do less with more, right? When you talk about marketing and partnerships, no, I think it becomes like what we're all doing, right? Trying to customize communications easier and faster, right? Being able to, instead of create generic communications with your partners, right? How can you use AI to do some customization around that, right? Like finding new partners, right? Can AI sort of help with that? Probably. I haven't really given a ton of thought on that, but there's opportunity there. And then, I think in the tools that are managing partners, right, finding trends that we just didn't even know were there, right? Like looking at, are there certain types of partners that I didn't I didn't have a classification for, or maybe based on geography or sort of the types of services that they operate, things that I didn't find, right? How can we sort of optimize that? And so I think there's probably an opportunity within the tools, right? Or plugging the existing tools with some of the, just the LLMs, right? And having the LLMs try and help find some of those things.
Very cool. That all lands for me. Second question. This is a pretty easy one. If people want to get in touch with you, follow up with any maybe questions that they might have had coming out of the podcast, how can folks do so?
Yeah. So I'm on LinkedIn, which is an easy one. And Tyler, I can give you email address or whatever it may be. But Joshua Meyer on LinkedIn. I should know the actual URL. I don't. I can give you that to Tyler, and we can sort of put it in the personal notes.
Yeah.
You can find me there. And then obviously you can find me through Muse. As the only sole marketer right now, I also answer the contact us for. So multiple hats at the moment. So you get to do that too. It might be easier, but happy to connect with folks who are going through the journey and yeah.
Very cool. I love it. Very much appreciate this conversation. I think there's some key things to really take out of this. For me, one is certainly just having that tight connection between your partners and your AEs. And I think certainly the recognition that not all partners are in it for monetary reasons. And so thinking about how you support them beyond that, I think is pretty cool. So Josh, thank you for this. Such a fun conversation.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. It was a pleasure, and hopefully people find value in this and helps them really grab. So I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you, Tyler.
All right. Thank you, sir. Thanks for listening to Get It Together. If you want more resources to help you build and scale your partnership program, be sure to follow us on your favorite podcast app. And get more proven tips and tools at partnerstack.com/getittogether.